So hi and thank you. My name is Lindsay and I'm going to present Games for Change. I'm actually going to present Game Verbs for Change, and I'll warn you right now, I have about 92 slides in about 12 minutes. So this is going to be pretty fast, if we can get my mic. Is that better? Try again. Yeah. Is that better? Yeah. Great. Okay.
No. Sorry. Wrong.
Oh.
You have no mic. You still have the music coming through.
Check. There we go. Great. Thank you. Okay. So my name is Lindsay Grace, and I'm going to be presenting Game Verbs for Change. Like I'd said, as a warning, I have about 92 slides. This is going to be a fast and furious Pecha on steroid style presentation. And I'll just get right into it. So the usual first question is, who am I? So it'd be nice if I turned on my clicker. So that question is answered via this slide. So I'm the Armstrong Professor of Creative Arts at Miami University. I'm also the director and founder of Persuasive Play Lab at Miami University. We do a lot of work with professional clients, corporate and not-for-profit. And then I also co-direct the AIMS Games Center at Miami University, which is our curriculum center for delivering games education. I'm also sort of an independent game designer, developer, and artist. I'm the person behind Critical Gameplay and Untitled Games, which does a lot of mobile development. So our program at Miami University has been ranked by GamePro Magazine and Princeton Review several years in a row as a top 25 games program, and our focus is on independent games and procedural rhetoric. In fall 2013, in case you're looking for me later, I'll actually be at American University where we're starting a new program in persuasive play and public purpose games. And that'll be both a graduate program and a game studio. So, in my history as a game instructor, I've taught 81 courses in areas related to game design, but primarily in game design. And in those 10 years, I've taught two basic principles to game designers. These are, one, game design is about interesting problems. And two, games are about doing. So I'll give you a quick review there. Interesting problems and doing. Remember that. Creating interesting problems sort of as a formula that I teach students. And that formula begins with determining your goal, creating an obstruction for your goal, and then trying to create a means to achieve that goal. So, if we took Super Mario Brothers as an example, the idea here is that you have a goal, get to the end of the level, save the princess, an obstruction, the distance, navigating platforms, the enemies, and you have a run, jump, and shoot as your means. These are the things you can do. So let's talk a little more detail about goals. So goals are often best when they are familiar and easy to understand. Common goals in a lot of digital games include things like getting to the end, collecting as many items as you can, finding an object or person, or completing a collection of items. For any of you who've read Brian Sutton Smith's 7 Rhetorics of Play, these should sound familiar, as they're very common things that people do when they play. They have collections, they like to travel, etc. So then the next question is sort of, what's a good obstruction? And I often frame obstruction as situational. So your character is hungry and needs food. Your character is weak and needs strength, like a power pellet. Your character is sad and needs passion, thank you, Elude. Maybe they're angry and seek revenge, which is a really common one. Or they're lonely and they need company. If the obstruction is compelling, we will want to play. If the means is enjoyable, we will want to continue to play. So I'll emphasize that again. If the obstruction is compelling, you'll want to play. You'll say, wow, that sounds like an interesting situation. I want to do that. And if the means is enjoyable, you'll continue to play. You'll get past that sort of novelty of, wow, this sounds like an interesting situation, and actually want to solve the problems. So let's talk about means. Means is really your game verbs. So what are game verbs? Let's look at an example. So if I took the verb run and the verb jump, and I connected them, I would have a game that looks like this. Anyone? Super simple. Donkey Kong, right? Or this one. Anyone? Robot Unicorn Attack. And so the idea here is that you've got the basic mechanics, the basic verbs of a standard platformer. And we could extend those by adding things like the verb to shoot. So anyone recognize this oldie but goodie? Metroid, thank you. And one of the things that I think is really important is this idea that there's procedural rhetoric, and that being the way that I solve my problems. So let's think about a standard platformer. It gives you only two solutions. You can either run or jump to solve your problems. And think about the kind of rhetoric, the argument as to how to solve a problem that is present there. And if you're really good at running and jumping, in a lot of games you matriculate into being able to shoot. So what's the rhetoric to solving problems there? You run, jump, and shoot your way to solutions. So the problem with making platformers for change, for example, is that your solution is always a run, jump, or shoot. So you want to learn more about using less water? Run, jump, and shoot your way to learning. You want to empathize with homelessness? Go ahead and run, jump, and shoot your way to empathy. Or you want to learn more about safe sex? Go ahead and run, jump, and shoot your way to safer sex, and see how that works for you. So the arguments we make about change start with our game verbs. Here's a random sort of game verb universe. And you'll see we have lots of things like shooting, learning, telling, saving, attracting, evaluating, empathizing, healing. And then there's the sort of standard verbs for a platformer. We have a run and a jump. But what if we coupled run and hide? We get Darfur's Dying's sort of first minigame, which is that you have a goal of collecting water, but your obstruction is the Janjaweed militia. And so you're running and hiding. Well, that's sort of interesting. It's particularly interesting if you think of all the other universe of verbs that could have been available. You could have shot, you could have jumped, you could have questioned, argued, or begged. But those aren't part of the procedural rhetoric that's present in this particular game. Let's try another pairing. So if you wanted to heal and run, you might try my game. So this is a game I made a couple of years ago called Healer, and it depicts the Nanjing Massacre. But instead of putting bullets into players, you're actually constantly pulling them out. So every player on the screen is already dead, and you're trying to revive them by literally pulling bullets out of them. And the idea here was this sort of critique of the tediousness of top-down shooters. So it's set up as a top-down shooter, but it's actually a top-down unshooter. If you give people verbs that help them practice getting past their obstruction, you're kind of teaching. They're getting this practice. And if you think of play as a sort of practice space and a teaching space, it's really interesting. So the game verb is often what the player needs to do to help end homelessness, or make healthy choices, use credit responsibly, or basically solve their problem. So let's look at a couple of verbs of political change. We'll do kind of a quick sweep of some of these interesting games for change. So this is McDonald's game that's been mentioned by others this week. And one of the interesting things is the verbs that it uses. Corrupt and feed. You can see the argument immediately, right? And what's really interesting is it's not just about feeding human beings, it's about feeding the cows, and sometimes you may even feed cows to cows. And this idea of managing the company is your main goal. And then papers, please. You have two basic, very binary verbs. You can either allow someone into the country or deny someone into the country. And what's interesting about that is that very few of these decisions are actually black and white. So framing it as a dichotomy, as a basic black and white decision through two verbs, really does make this situation very interesting. And then this added level of empathy that's available to you because you know that you are providing for your family by doing this kind of examination. So while we're on empathy, let's look at another example. Lim, which is also in the Hall of Fame, the idea of moving and blending. So move is a familiar verb, we see it all the time, but blending is interesting. And it's particularly interesting if you think of the sort of context and the questions it raises. So how does it feel to keep trying to fit in? And that's your action. That's the only other recourse you have in a competitive world. Or the question around, is it an effective verb? Are you really good at blending? And then for whom is it effective? Is it effective for the non-player character or for you? I would kind of argue that I think a lot of the benefit is for the non-player characters, so they stop beating you up in Lim. But at the end of the day, it actually makes gameplay harder for you when you blend. So it's interesting to use verbs that way. Another game, an older game from USC, Hush, is another good example of a single verb game. So here you're calming, and what you're doing is you're trying to keep a baby from crying with a militia outside your window, and they're sort of attracted to the sound of the baby crying. So there's a sort of question about how it feels to keep order under an impending threat. So you have the design goal of trying to experiment with that feeling at the same time that you are giving them but a single verb, which is to calm. And then I've been doing a lot of research around affection games because I think it's an interesting space. And one of my sort of first forays into affection games is a game called Big Huggin'. The way Big Huggin' works is that you have one verb available to you, which is the hug, And this little bear on screen is perpetually moving forward, and so all you can do is give him a giant hug in order to get him past his obstacles. And the controller is a 30-inch stuffed animal. What you allow the player to do is really as important as what you don't allow the player to do, and this is really important for critical design. So a lot of people would probably mention September 12th in this context. So September 12th basically allows you to shoot or do nothing. And most players used to thinking, I've got to do my verb, shoot. And when they shoot, all they're doing is sort of making the world worse. Every time they shoot, they're essentially creating more terrorists. And it's less of a game and more of a toy, but it's an interesting situation around deciding what the appropriate sort of verb is. Wait, which is in the Hall of Fame, another one of my games in critical gameplay. The way wait works is that you move and you wait. And I was really interested in the idea of encouraging people to stop and enjoy the environments that are created for them. And so wait works that way, which is kind of ironic given how fast I'm presenting that I made this game, but I only have 15 minutes, guys. Okay, and then this is one of my student games. I've been teaching sort of critical design, critical gameplay for the last couple of years, 5-6 years, to my students. I really don't let them make first-person shooters and standard platformers anymore. And so this is one of the student games that's done rather well. This is Don't Kill the Cow, and the way that Don't Kill the Cow works is that you have a non-player character who's perpetually asking you for food, and you have the option at any given time to use the space bar to kill the cow. And so there's just sort of a question around, do you kill the cow? Maybe you're a vegetarian, you're not interested in killing the cow, or do you make the non-player character suffer? So your inaction or your lack of verbing is part of what's interesting in this game. I want to emphasize this idea of not doing as a critical game verb. So the idea that I give you everything you need to do things, and you must choose whether or not to. So that's very different. If you think of some games, like a first-person shooter, if you try to survive a first-person shooter and not shoot, the game is very punishing for that. And that's an explicit decision, right? We need to goat you into shooting things. So it's interesting to play it as a pacifist. And then, real quickly, I just want to talk to you guys about verb selection. So you have to ask yourself as you're designing these games if you think your verbs are enticing and interesting to players. And so, like I said, I'm actually going to be talking at Digra in a couple of months, I guess, about a content analysis I did for Affection Games. And so I want you guys for 10 seconds to think of the way you would make a game around flirting. And I'm just going to shut up and give you a second to talk, or think. Hopefully you have an image of flirting right now. Did it look like this? Probably not, right? And so that's really interesting. The verb's there. Wow, cool, a game about flirting. But that's not really how I understand flirting to work. And they actually have a competitive flirt, so two people kind of do this like stare of death. But what's interesting is that's really just a shooting game, right? That's not really a new verb. It's a shooting game where we've attached this context that makes it sound like it's a flirting game. So I want to remind you that implementation is as important as selection. You have to ask yourself, are my verbs interesting? So I'll admit right now, I've made some lousy games, and so here's an example of one of those lousy games. I had this really strong intention that I wanted to make a game for about the third world, sort of subvert the Tom Clancy approach and have a game where a third world African nation is gaining its independence from a first world nation. And so I decided good verbs would be shoot, canvas, and steal. Which one of those sounds awful? Canvas. It's a chore verb. So I talked to students about the idea of chore verbs. There are some things you don't want to do whether or not they're in games. Not a lot of people are dying to do cold call over and over and over again. Get rejected on the phone over and over and over again. It'll be great. Although there are opportunities for designing play, and I put a couple up there, and I explicitly left wait on there because there are ways to make wait work, and there are ways to make all of these work. You have to ask yourself, what arguments are you trying to make? So if we look at the fundamentals, I really do think we can get the formula right. I do want to remind you that digital games are far less limited than the analog world. We often think in the sort of physical space and think about movement as right, left, or north, south. But in reality, we construct those spaces so we have the ability to make any kind of rules we want. And I want to remind you also that we're not just making games for change. We're making poetic arguments about what is good, right, and important. And that's really important. So the question I'll leave you with, with a little time to go, is what game verbs will you create next? Thank you. If you're still awake, I have 2.5 minutes, I think, of question time, if anyone has any questions.
What's your favorite verb?
My favorite verb? Wow. I'm really excited about the affection verbs. So there's basically 4 affection verbs. I'm publishing them. There's kiss, hug, flirt, and sex. They seem better, yeah, they're good verbs, right? Everyone likes that. Another question? Yes?
Twitter handle.
My Twitter handle is mindtoggle.com. The question was, what is your Twitter handle? Or, I'm sorry, just mindtoggle, actually. Other questions? Still processing? Yes?
You mentioned that you limit first-person shooter and platformers for your students. Why?
I'm sorry, can you say that? So is the question, why do I limit first-person shooters and the others? Part of it is that I'm trying to get students to think more broadly about game design in general. And so the idea of mimicking didn't seem to help them a lot. The first 3 years that I taught in game design, I actually taught at a commercial arts school where we were really prepping them for that first job, and it was make a good first-person shooter because that'll be good for your reel so we can get you a job at Midway. That's no longer the case. I've been teaching at a liberal arts institution for a while, and we're in Cincinnati, Ohio, which means we're not sending a lot of people to AAA developers. And so I'm trying to get them to sort of win the indie game, if you will, by thinking very critically about what they're doing. Yes, another question.
What indie games do you think have been designed really successfully other than the ones you mentioned?
Sure. So the question was, what other indie games do I think have been very successful and outside of the ones that I mentioned? And I mean, the obvious one is anything from that game company, in my perspective. They just hit the nail on the head. So if you think of, obviously, Journey and Flower, I find that my students who aren't necessarily, say, Call of Duty players, come back and say, wow, I didn't know games could be like this. And I think that's really powerful and wonderful. Sorry, that was sort of low-hanging fruit. There are lots of other great games, but off the top of my head. Other questions? Yes?
Can we get a hold of your presentation?
I will make, the question was, can I get a hold of your presentation? I will make the presentation available at my website, which is professorgrace.com or lgrace.com, and I have a whole collection of other presentations that I've made, so I'll just put that there in the next 24 hours, 48 hours. Thank you. 40 seconds left, if anyone has one last burning question. All right, oh, yes?
Do you use verbs? Do you start with the verb and apply it to game design, or start with the game concept?
I start with the goal. So the most important thing, especially for the persuasive play that we design, is I want to know what argument needs to be made, and then you need to say, well, what would make that situation interesting? So what sort of obstacles can I put in people's way? And sometimes they're quite literally the same obstacles that we see in life. So if it were homelessness as a subject, we may say, you know, there may be inequity or something. And then we resolve that by coming up with verbs that are interesting to play as well. And I think that's our last question. So thank you guys. Have a great day.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next presentation is called A Quandary of Sorts and will be presented